Okay, so I am going to be talking about an individual analysis of the development of a cancer symptom in a particular family. So I'm going to be talking about cancer diagnosis and a death as a product of the family emotional system. Move that so you can see. There we go. It doesn't want to use this. There we go. So what I'm talking about is actually a common pattern of family emotional process, and by that I mean the development of a symptom in a family when an important family member leaves or lifts off from the system, especially a child. It's a common time in a family for the development of a symptom in the child, in the parents, in the other children behind. And the concept would be that the balance of the family is disturbed when an important child leaves home. And I'm going to talk about my family because I know it best. And I could have chosen clinical families in which I've seen this phenomenon happen, but I've been studying my family for 48 years, and I hope I know something about it by now. And I thought I could maybe give a more in-depth analysis of this process using it. So let me frame the presentation with some suggestions from Bowen theory that are going to be overarching what I'm going to describe in my own family. You've heard some of this. I'm afraid that Michael Kerr and I have been married too long and thinking too long in Bowen theory. So some of this is going to sound like a replay or like we're clones. You can decide. Symptoms in family are driven by a disturbance in the family. I swear we didn't know what each other is presenting. A disturbance in the family leads to increased chronic anxiety, and increased chronic anxiety affects physiology. Now, Mike Kerr and Mike Lumpkin and other people in this room know a whole lot more about the details of that. I have what I would call an avocational interest in the way that chronic anxiety affects physiology because of my original beginning in a nursing profession. But I don't have the in-depth knowledge that others will be talking about. Bowen theory also suggests that this particular diagnosis and death were related to the absence of the older child, physically and emotionally, the impending departure of the younger child, the inability of the two mates to deal with each other without what I call on-site buffers, aka children. Dogs and cats sometimes do it too. And that the anxiety generated by such major changes in the family and the way they threatened the status quo, the homeostasis, could lead to vulnerability to a major symptom and death. In talking about vulnerability to symptoms, I'm going to suggest the following components. That the person most vulnerable to the symptoms is the one most adapting to the others and giving up the most self in the system. And I'm going to suggest, and I've drawn this way, with the female eclipsing, the red female eclipsing the blue male, to suggest that my father was adapting more to my mother than vice versa, although each were adapting to the pressures and the fusion between the two of them. Now, in the whole chronology that I'm going to tell you about, a number of couples would deal with this by divorcing. One or the other would bail. As I tell you the story, I'm going to build a case for the way in which bailing was not an option for my father. And I'll give you some facts to support that hypothesis as we go along. So here's the beginning of the story. This is my grandfather, Russ Sr. He is a second oldest in a family of 4. He's the oldest male, has an older sister and 2 younger brothers. He grows up in Pennsylvania. He goes to college. He becomes an agricultural expert and an expert on nitrogen fertilizer. He becomes a kind of national expert. He is at high-level organizations. He's in Who's Who in America. He's functional outside the home. He is a bit of a somaticizer at home, and he's kind of babied at home in his original family and in the family that he creates. He marries his high school sweetheart, my grandmother, after he graduates from college.
Mute the lavalier.
Pardon?
Mute the lavalier, or take it away, or mute the other microphone.
What's wrong?
He just said if Kathy has lavalier on, take the other microphone.
No, the lavalier is not on. It's not even near me.
Okay.
She is a high school graduate. She works outside the home. They marry after he graduates from college. And they have 2 children. Russ Jr., he's not really a junior, but I'm going to refer to him as Russ, and Peg, his younger sister, 2 years younger than he. There's a lot else that happens, but in 1925, they divorce, and they split the children the way I have shown it here. The elder, my father, goes with his father, and the younger Peg goes with the mother. An interesting side note is that my grandfather names a correspondent in the divorce, so apparently my grandmother was not just staying home and tending the home fires. Margaret goes home with her daughter to her hometown and lives there with her parents and her daughter, my aunt. And within a few years, she marries another high school sweetheart. Apparently she was quite active in high school. And he had been waiting and pining for her. Peg, in anticipation of her mother's marriage, quickly marries her beau, concerned about being a 5th wheel in the new marriage. The new husband dies within a year of the marriage, so be careful what you yearn for. So back to Russ, my father, here. When the divorce happens, his father places him in boarding school, and he spends the next 4 years in a boarding school and has what for him is a very pleasant and productive period of time. With periodic visits from his mother and his sister. Both of their locations were in Pennsylvania. Russ Sr. remarries 2 years after the divorce, a former neighbor of theirs when they lived in the District of Columbia. Russ, my father, is very fond of his stepmother, and they have a pleasant relationship. An interesting development that happens is that in the crash of 1929, Russ Sr. loses his position in Washington and his shirt, and Russ and Ruth retire to live on the weekend farm that they have in Pennsylvania. Russ, my father, has been the responsible older brother of a younger sister. He has a history of somatization, and he is regarded as a sickly and a weak child. He appears calm externally. He's sort of on the way down in his family. He comes from 3 generations of college graduates and professional people. He drops out of college in his junior year of college. This is a picture of him with his grandfather at his grandfather's 50th college reunion, and he is a student at the college at that time. He drops out. He has no direction in his life when he drops out of college. He comes back to Pennsylvania. He works in retail for a while and then eventually gets a position in the state. I don't know this factually, but both my grandfather and my step-grandmother were very well connected politically, and I wouldn't be surprised if that had something with him getting that position. Now I'm going to switch to the other side of the family. This is my mother's side of the family. Her family is from Iowa. This is a blue-collar working family. Bentley, my grandfather, is the second oldest of 10 children, the most functional and the most successful in the family, with a quite dysfunctional older brother. My grandmother, Annie, is the eldest of 5. She is very close to her next oldest sister, there's 2 of them. Both Ben and Annie are from the same town in Iowa, and after they marry, they move 30 miles west to a small railroad junction town, and they run a restaurant and hotel in that town. This is my mother, this is their family, and this is my mother, Aggie, and she is the last born and only survivor of 7 children. 3 are either born dead or die the day of their birth, and the other 3 die from childhood illnesses, diphtheria, meningitis, and diphtheria at ages 11, 1, and 1.5. It's interesting, this last one, the 1.5, is the son of Bentley's sister, an illegitimate son of his sister that they adopt, and that child also dies at 1.5. Now, whenever I present my mother's family history, many people have an emotional response to the deaths of her 6 siblings before her birth. And the focus usually seems to be on the losses and the trauma of those losses and the impact on my grandmother, Annie. Bowen, I'm not discounting that, but Bowen theory has led me over the years to another putatively more important background process. Even in these times, losing 6 children was very unusual. So it leads me to a question: what was the family emotional process that looks like it was inimical to the survival of children in this nuclear unit? Were Bentley and Annie so emotionally dependent on each other that the addition of children unbalanced their system? Did such a hypothesized unbalance show up as an increased level of chronic anxiety? Were children in such an atmosphere more vulnerable to ambient infectious diseases? The difference, interestingly enough, when my mother is born and survives, is that Bentley has been diagnosed with terminal renal disease. And it's clear that he is not going to survive. Did this leave the space for her to survive, to take her father's place with her mother? Bentley dies, that's the question. All about these deaths, that's the question. Bentley dies when Aggie is 14 months old. Annie stays and runs the restaurant for the next 11 years after his death. Annie grows up with Aggie as her only child, and Aggie reports Annie thought the sun rose and set in my face. This could have been set up by the deaths of all these previous siblings so that she seemed a little bit more important than just the average offspring. Aggie also described Annie as quietly controlling. The basic living together unit, once Bentley dies, is Aggie and Annie. It's here. In 1926, when Aggie was 13, Annie moves them to Pennsylvania to be close to that next older sister. She supports them with the money from the sale of the restaurant and the hotel and by taking in roomers. Aggie was fun-loving, overtly anxious, and sometimes helpless appearing. She was on the way up in her family, completing secretarial school and landing a job in a new state agency during the Great Depression. That job has Annie and Aggie move to the state capital. They continue to live together with other young female roomers who help to provide income. In 1935, the pair meets. Russ has a friend who talks him into going to Aggie and Annie's apartment to go out on a double date with one of the roomers that the friend is fancying and whoever else they can pick up. The girl Russ's friend fancies is out with someone else. Annie and Aggie go out with the two guys. Russ and Aggie start dating. Wish I could have been on that first date. They were apparently, my mother and grandmother were riding in the trundle seat in the back of the model whatever Ford that they all went out. In May of 1937, Russ and Aggie marry by eloping to Hagerstown, Maryland for a civil marriage because of their difficulty dealing with Annie's opposition to Aggie marrying a non-Catholic. They come back, announce the legal marriage to Annie, and remarry in the Catholic Church within a week. Now they're living together, and this new living together unit equals the three of them, Annie, Russ, and Aggie. It took me a long time to figure out what the heck you get out of a marriage like this. But, you know, his mother has been absent from daily contact since he was 15 at the time of the divorce. And he gets a mother. And they sort of reportedly adored each other, and she him, and he gets a live-in mother as well as a wife. Now, Russ's parents are in active contact at this time. Here's Russ with his father, Aggie, his stepmother, his sister, and my older first cousin. This is Russ and Margaret, his mother, on a visit. Annie is in active contact with her family back in Iowa, in her extended family. Aggie is trying to get pregnant, and she has one miscarriage. Fast forward from 1937 to 1942, World War II intervenes. Russ is drafted into the Army. He becomes a supply sergeant. He has physical symptoms every time his unit is about to be transferred overseas and is in the hospital each time. So he gives his entire service in the United States, never gets shipped over. He goes off and the living unit reverts to Annie and Aggie, shown at about this time. So he's gone and they're the living unit. In 1943, Kathleen, yours truly, is conceived after 6 years of marriage and only one pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage. Was there room in this marriage for children? Was this pair so interdependent that there wasn't space for children? Did the threat of losing Russ in World War II make possible the conception, retention, and birth of this pregnancy? Did the pregnancy fill Russ's space with Aggie? The Sounds like my grandparents, so maybe multi-generational process. Isn't she cute? October 1943, Kathleen is born. Aggie stops working with this birth. The living unit is now Annie, Aggie, and Kathleen. Russ visits once when Kathleen is 10 months old. In 1944, there's the first overt marital instability. Russ is in Nebraska. Annie, Aggie, and Kathleen are in Pennsylvania, and he becomes involved in an affair. Is this affair connected to the birth of Kathleen and Aggie's shifting energies to her new child? I meant to add some lovely shifting lines, lest you think I escaped family emotional process. You need some lines here between my mother and myself. Is Russ needy? Does Aggie now have Kathleen? Who does Russ have? In response to Russ's plea to spend time with him and save the marriage, Aggie goes and visits him in Nebraska and leaves Kathleen in the care of Annie, and the affair ends. In 1945, Russ returns home, resumes work for the state. Kathleen is 22 months old, and the living unit is Annie, Aggie, Russ, and Kathleen. From 1944 to 1946, Kathleen has a number of moderate physical symptoms: tonsillitis, otitis media, 2 surgeries of tonsillectomies and adenoidectomies. In the same period, Russ Sr. begins developing heart disease, has several MIs, and is becoming a cardiac cripple. During the same period, early in the year of 1946, Margaret moves to California to be with her third husband at his pressure to live near his 2 living nieces. He was a Canadian naval officer in the war and has been demobilized. They moved to be close to his family. From California, Margaret is an active grandmother with cards, letters, and presents. She visits every other year, staying with her 2 children and their families for long periods, but she is no longer on the scene. During this period, Annie, here shown at Kathleen's 2-year-old birthday party, she likes cake, as you can see, is a very active caretaker and a contributor to the emotional unit. Then, beginning in 1946, Annie's functioning begins to become progressively decreased. She develops significant heart disease, and she begins to develop what was then called senility, and she's debilitated with both of them over the next couple of years. In May of 1946, Kathleen is hospitalized for a week for what is diagnosed in the next year as a kidney infection. A year later, in May of 1947, Kathleen is hospitalized for a month with severe life-threatening kidney infection. She has emergency surgery to correct a number of congenital anomalies which have been feeding the infection, and she recovers. In September of 1947, Susan is born. She's a very colicky baby. She's allergic to breast milk. I don't know that that's physically possible. Constantly crying. She's the focus of intense anxiety on the part of her mom and the doctor. There are many formulas tried. Aggie is very involved with her from the beginning. She feels she disappointed Russ by not having a boy and feels protective of Susan. Thank God for Susan. The more intense child focus, there's those lines between me and my mother that should have been in the earlier slides, shifts from Kathleen to Susan. Aggie is a bit waterlogged after Susan's birth. Remember, she's an only child with no experience of siblings. She's anxious about handling 2 children at one time and being fair to them both. She's anxious about Susan's development. She's anxious about Susan's acceptance by Russ. The birth of Susan is also a marker of even more decrease in functioning on the part of Annie, sorry. Annie was an active caretaker of Kathleen. She is now being taken care of by Aggie. So she is caring for 2 young children and a bedridden, debilitated mother. Waterlogged might describe that situation. In 1948, within 6 months of my sister's birth, Russ reveals he's having another affair and he desires to leave and marry the other woman. Aggie, is she preoccupied with her mother and her daughter? Is she less available for Russ's needs? Is he left dangling and gets focused elsewhere? I think about how compromised you have to be as a responsible older son to think that leaving a mother with 2 young children and a dying mother is a really good thing to do. Aggie, when she learns that Russ is leaving, makes a very serious suicide attempt, which involves drugs and serious cutting, and she is hospitalized for 2 weeks subsequent to the blood loss. Russ ends the affair and whips back into the marriage. He copes in 2 ways. First of all, he views Aggie as fragile and a bit crazy and assumes a posture of whatever it takes to keep you happy, to keep you from committing suicide. These are 2 very important emotional processes in the family from here on. And he enlists Kathleen. She may volunteer, she is an older, helpful child, to keep Aggie calm. Kathleen views the marital problem through Russ's eyes and sees her mother as the problem. Kathleen has an involved, attuned but scratchy relationship with Aggie and an over-positive relationship with Russ. She's an over-responsible, conforming achiever. She becomes Aggie's and Russ's helper, both physically and emotionally. In April of 1948, Russ and Aggie go on a honeymoon, leaving their daughters in the care of Peg and her husband and their 2 cousins. On their return home, they discover that Russ Sr. has died at the age of 63. Please note that both Russ and Aggie's fathers died young at 63 and 46. The family emotional process in both families seems to generate dysfunction terminating in a death of a spouse. Less than a year later, Annie dies at 76. She's been bedridden more than the last year of her life. Russ and Aggie take Annie's body to Iowa for burial. They do what I call a drive-by funeral and stay one night and return. In other words, no real emotional contact with the family in Iowa, which is active and deep at that point. With Annie's death, Aggie effectively becomes cut off from their family. in Iowa. There's some ritual Christmas card contact, but no real connection. So my background hypothesis is that this family, around the time of my sister's birth, the first suicide attempt, became a chronically regressed family. After a constellation of events, the birth of my sister, which was destabilizing to my mother, the decline of Annie's functioning, the death of Russ Sr., and the way the family members responded to these events. Russ considering leaving the family, Aggie's suicide attempt, and then the adaptation of Russ and the enlisting of Kathleen set the stage for a chronically anxious family with a form of adaptation. I believe that the family was in a chronically lower state of functioning and was vulnerable to future changes. One sec while I catch up with myself. One could argue that Kathleen and Susan grew up in quantitatively different families with regards to the level of chronic anxiety and the level of self. In May of 1949, Kathleen is hospitalized with kidney pain again. No cause is found. Remember, this problem has been fixed. So something's going on. Now, going forward, there's a period of no seriously overt marital conflict, but a palpable distance between the partners. There's periodic arguing, and there's periodic suicidal talk, which I've symbolized with this purple thingy inside Aggie. In 1953, Aggie returns to work as Susan enters elementary school. She works near the home. Russ and Aggie's sexual relationship ceases with relation to his impotency. This was reported to me years later by Aggie. I report on this not to be salacious, but to describe the level of emotional distance that has been institutionalized in this marriage. And then comes a period which I call the battle of the backs. A moderate, non-life-threatening set of symptoms occurs where one or the other of them has back symptoms and a back surgery about every other year for a period of years. The focus continues on Susan. There's worry about her eating and her thinness. She also has a number of tonsillitis and otitis media. She has more tonsillectomies and adenoidectomies. She is brighter than Kathleen, but not working up to her potential. You've heard that phrase before. In 1956, Kathleen assumes responsibility for most of the housework with respect to Aggie's back symptoms. Interestingly enough, when Kathleen goes off to college, somehow Aggie gets the work done. In 1961, Kathleen leaves for college. She goes to DC, about 110 miles away. She has a kind of getting out of Dodge spin on her, but she does maintain regular contact. There's no cutoff. In fact, Aggie insists on frequent contact, and Russ supports supports her in that demand. The intensity of Russ and Susan and Aggie, Russ and Aggie and Susan intensifies. Susan has a less successful adjustment to high school than Kathleen. In 1963, Kathleen gets a military scholarship to pay for the last 2 years of college. This has been a long planned as a way to finance her education because the family can't afford the whole education. She plans to request California for her first duty station and Europe for her second. during a 3-year obligation. She's headed out into the world. Susan is planning to follow in Kathleen's footsteps with a college nursing degree and a military scholarship. This is to show Kathleen is headed out into the world. In 1964, Kathleen begins a different relationship with a male. It's more serious from the beginning. In March of 1964, Russ has exploratory surgery because of lung and digestive symptoms. Surgeons remove a tumor from his lung and mediastinum. He's diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. The prognosis is 6 months life expectancy. This is a little sidebar, but the doctor and Aggie decide to withhold this information from Russ. He's told they got it all. Everyone else in the family knows the truth and collaborates in the deception. This is one of the major areas in my life I would like a do-over on for myself. Russ proceeds with radium treatment to ensure the cure. The surgery and the radiation relieve his symptoms. In May of 1964, the male asks Kathleen not to travel in the military and not to date during the summer. Since said male is unprepared to make any further commitment to the relationship, she declines to be exclusive. In June, Kathleen returns home for the summer vacation. It is not a summer vacation. It is intense. In August, Russ has figured out that his symptoms have returned and asks Aggie for the truth. After she fesses up, his functioning takes a dive. In that climate, Kathleen returns to college in September. She becomes engaged shortly thereafter. Marriage is planned for June of 1966, after the male will graduate from medical school. In November of 1964, Aggie takes a position with Russ that nobody's winning here. I imagine her kind of slapping him up the side of the head. And he comes to, and his functioning improves, and he undertakes a responsible process of preparing for his death. For example, he was an extensive stamp and postcard collector, planned to do that as a retirement business, and he sells off those collections in an orderly way. This is the last professional picture taken of Russ and Aggie in their home. Around the same time, Kathleen requests a military duty station as close to home as possible. In 1965, Kathleen graduates from college. She will be stationed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, about 2 hours from home, and Susan graduates from high school. Russ is too ill to attend, but I gave him these eyes because he sees his girls graduate. In July of 1965, Russ dies. Please note he has outlived his prognosticated life expectancy by 10 months, perhaps a testimony to his desire to see his girls graduate. On his death day, he asks for some alone time with each family member. What does he want to say to Kathleen? Take care of my poor Aggie. And what does she say? Sure, Dad. Could I record, this is a second do-over, important one that I would like to have. The year following Russ's death, Aggie is highly upset. She later reports, my mother and my husband ran my life until then, and I had to learn how to run my own life. The marriage of Kathleen is impending and becomes a focus of tension between Aggie and Kathleen. As generally happens with Aggie, when she gets anxious, she pushes on others. So she's pushing Kathleen, who is actually organizing and paying for the wedding herself. Aggie is frequently orating, time is running out. So much so that as Kathleen's last bridal attendant, who has lived in her group home with her, starts down the aisle. She turns to Kathleen and says, "Time has run out." Kathleen and Michael, you've guessed that that's who he is, right? Marry. In the fall of 1966, Susan is having problems with college. Kathleen, at Aggie's request, meets with the dean of Susan's school to see what we can do to help poor Susan. Another do-over, please? In January of 1967, Susan announces to Aggie in a telephone call that she is changing educational plans. She's in the middle of exams and anxious about outcomes. She'll be leaving her current university after one more semester and will change majors. Aggie makes a second suicide attempt. In June, Susan returns home to live with Aggie, attend local college, and work. Their living together disrupts within 6 months. Susan moves out, continues working and attending college while living in the same town as Aggie. She has moderate symptoms of alcohol and substance use and sexual promiscuity. She finally graduates in 1973, a 7-year wonder with a degree in English literature. This is the second serious suicide attempt, and this is a side note, and I'm running out of time, so I'll run through it quickly. The hypothesis is that the serious suicide attempts were related to the wife's emotional dependency on her husband and her children. The first occurred with the threatened loss of relationship with the husband. The second one occurred in the aftermath of the husband's death, Kathleen's investment in her marriage and career, and Susan's uncertain course. Aggie lost her bearings, and the second suicide attempt occurred. This could be a whole presentation, what I call clinical hypothesis testing. The idea would be that suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts represent a disproportional absorption of chronic anxiety in one member of a family emotional system. All members of the family are inadvertently playing a part in this process. Change in any member can change that reciprocal process and lower the chronic anxiety that leads to suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. It would be another whole presentation to discuss how I ultimately got my opportunity to be less captivated by my mother's suicidal ideation and attempts. My mother made one last suicidal attempt related to changes in my nuclear family unit. I responded quite differently this time, and she never made another attempt, and she did not talk suicidal ideation afterwards. So in summary, a chronically regressed family, after a constellation of events that included the birth of Susan, which was destabilizing to Aggie, the decline of Annie's functioning, less of a help, more of a drain, the death of Russ Sr., and the way the family members responded to these events. The affair, Russ considering leaving the family, Aggie's suicide attempt, the adaptation of Russ, and the enlisting of Kathleen led to the family being in a chronically lower state of functioning, vulnerable to future changes. The further destabilizing changes that happened were Annie's death, the cutoff of Aggie from her extended family, the geographical distance of Margaret, the husband's mother, and then, last but not least, the departure of the key stabilizer of the marital triangle, aka Kathleen. The impending departure of the last available on-site triangle, Susan. So Bowen theory suggests that the diagnosis and death were related to the absence of the older child physically and emotionally, the impending departure of the younger, and the inability of the mates to deal with each other without on-site buffers. The anxiety generated by such major changes in the family could lead to vulnerability to a major symptom and death. The person most vulnerable to the symptoms is the one adapting the most to the other, giving up the most self to the system. I'm arguing that that was my father, and that he foreclosed the option to save himself by divorcing relative to being captured by the threat of a suicide on the part of his spouse. So the major points would be, one can conceptualize such a death as a manifestation of chronic stress relative to the inability to maintain self in important relationships in a vulnerable, regressed family, and that such an analysis could apply to other symptoms, physical, social, or emotional. Thank you. Let me get out of the share and turn it over to our moderator. And you're going to bring in the other camera, correct?
Not until somebody has them up.
Hmm?
Do you want another camera now? Or
Yeah.
another at the-
Oh, well, when it goes to the Q&A, yeah. Good.
No, you don't need the one. So, good morning. My name is Dr. Carolyn Jacobs. I'm a licensed psychologist in San Diego. And I have a private practice in San Diego and have this training program through the lens of Bowen theory, Southern California education and training of Bowen theory. I'd like to invite all the panelists to come up, please. Dr. Kerr, Dr. Wilkin, Kathleen Kerr is here, and then Joan Winkowski. So I'll introduce quickly the panel. Most of you know everyone, but Dr. Lumpkin is invited guest speaker. Dr. Lumpkin is professor of biochemistry and cellular and molecular biology at Georgetown University, and he's the past chairman of the Department of Physiology and Biophysics at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Okay, that's better. Dr. Michael Kerr, obviously director of Bowen Theory Academy and director emeritus of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family in Washington, D.C. Kathleen Kerr, clinical nurse specialist, founding board member of the Bowen Theory Academy and coordinator of the Family History Database Project in the Bowen Theory Academy Research Seminar. And then Joan Jerkowski, Mrs. Jerkowski, a licensed clinical counselor in Maryland and Washington, D.C., and she is on the faculty at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family in Washington, D.C. So what I'm going to tell you about our panel discussion, I'm going to first open it up to the panel for their comments, and then we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, and we'll be going from in-person questions here. If you have a question, you can come up to the microphone. And then we'll be having the Zoom participants who are out in the diaspora coming in. They're going to be asking questions through the queue, and Dr. Jeff Jacobs will be reading their questions for the panelists to answer. So that's how it's going to go. So first of all, let me open it up to Dr. Lumpkin to see if you would like to lead off with any comments or questions from the presentations this morning.
Well, I appreciated all the talks, and I think.
Are they on?
Is it
I
on?
don't think they're on.
Yeah, look closer.
So I appreciated your two talks this morning. It will also feed right into what I'll be talking about later. So going back to your presentation about cancer. So, some people think or maintain that chronic stress can lead to the development of cancer, but actually triggering that aberrant cell division. But do you believe that that's the case, or do you believe that the process of becoming a cancerous tumor begins and then stress has some kind of impact on that? process. Not causing the cancer, but spreading the cancer, let's say. But he's going to.
Well, I think it's skin cancers are dramatically higher in Australia and parts of Africa, which suggests to me that the development of these things doesn't necessarily depend on emotional variables. And I couldn't necessarily assume that a tumor would be caused by stress, but definitely it could play into how the body reacts to it.
Or you can put it down like this.
Okay.
So it comes closer to you.
I think Gary's video, Gary has his volume on, that wasn't turned on.
You're supposed to have this one.
Just reading Stephen Cole was useful to me, just to think about, you don't have to explain the whole deal. Stress, that certainly with aging, cancers appear often all over the body. I think the ratio of 70-year-old men died of other causes. They had 20 cancers that were latent in the body. And these cancers are dependent on other factors to proliferate and spread. So again, it would make sense to me to say the stress doesn't necessarily cause the cancer. Together you think that way too.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Joan, would you like to?
Yes, one of the things I was thinking along those same lines that came out of both of these presentations was, well, it's really a question. I'm thinking underlying these presentations was the suggestion that physical symptoms work the same as emotional symptoms in reflecting processes in families. And I think that way, but I know if I was to tell people that aren't thinking from the Bowen theory that way, which I have suggested with physical kinds of symptoms, it's kind of a radical thought, but I just was wondering about the speakers thinking about that.
I have a comment I'll make.
It's better.
Related to Kathy's presentation, it's a powerful story, powerfully told, very interesting. If I knew all this before I married her, I wouldn't have gone through with it. I'd love for a more differentiated care. Of course, she would reject me, so there it is. What was the question again? But just also that in listening to the story, I felt myself with instinctive resistance to accepting the idea this thing can all be interconnected to family emotional process, even though I think it's a very persuasive, still yet to be completely proven presentation of it. And as I tried to show, I think a lot of the science is backing that up, but we're still not there yet. So I forget what your question was. Oh, did I answer it? That's my problem. I answer questions without knowing what the questions were.
Well, I was going to say that in my esteemed colleague and partner's family, symptoms occurred in an emotional way. So that you've heard him present about the development of the schizophrenic diagnosis in his brother. But at the same time, in a very intensely anxious and regressed period, his father develops a physical symptom and dies. So, I don't think of it as either or, this process, and I think that's part of the genius of Bowen. And Bowen theory is that he postulated that physical, emotional, and social symptoms are generated is maybe a bad word, potentiated by the same family emotional processes. So he didn't draw a distinction. I think you're pointing out to both your and Mike's comments that people tend to separate those. But did you want to say more about what you were thinking?
I did want to comment on on-site buffers. I think kids should be renamed OSBs. On-site buffers. Let's have an OSB here. It'll help.
I wanted to comment also on Ms. Kerr's presentation. A couple of questions that I had was you suggested that that the deaths of the children, I hadn't thought about it this way, of how it is a person who lives or dies in a family, if they die at a young age, because I have this in the extended family, that it has something to do with the marriage and maybe how intensely connected the couple is. And I thought that was interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. But that was a good example. And then I was thinking that, then also you pointed out there was a couple of pointers for yourself that you wish you had a do-over. And I was thinking that's useful to think about how each person in a way, they weren't major things, but how each person in a way contributes to the regression or could possibly manage differently in a way that could help. Like I'm thinking that your mother got herself together when your father was dying and slapped him so that he did a little bit better. And that was probably a help to the whole family.
Well, I would just say I was lucky that my mother lived to be 95, and I had a lot of time for do-overs with my mother. And that at the time that she died, the relationship with her was extremely different than what it was at the time that my father died. And that's lucky. So I got a lot of time to work on the do-overs. I didn't get that with my father, but that was the luck of the draw. I think do-overs are in front of our eyes all the time, and we can all visualize do-overs and do better at doing them over.
Kathy, I wanted to ask you too. You had mentioned that when things were not going well in the family, you developed some renal symptoms from time to time. The other side of the coin, for instance, when you got married, you were, in a happy relationship, did your renal symptoms disappear? Did you ever have a problem with any more renal issues?
Not since 1949. I've specialized in other symptoms since then.
So,
We have to go into that detail.
no, I just wanted to know if your overall feeling of health, and that was one manifestation of it, improved when you were in your happiest period, perhaps, or a happy period.
I think if you got the record from Bethesda Naval Hospital of my visits to the sick bay for serious sinus infections, you would say that it wasn't totally idyllic.
Okay, so why don't we open it up for questions from the audience? If you'd like to step, can you hear me? Open it up for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to step up to the microphone, anyone?
While people are stepping up, I can say something else. Give you a few minutes to step up. Dr. Kerr, I thought your presentation was very interesting, but there's a lot to take in. And I guess the one question I had that I hadn't quite heard you talk about before was you had talked about under regression, and I wasn't quite clear on it, people's need for or sensitivity to approval, attention, expectation, and distress. People are more sensitive to that. And I haven't quite thought that through, but I think what you're saying is that under maybe when people are reactive, those emotions come to play and could possibly contribute to more of aggression. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I don't think Kathy would mind me telling the story that averting a potential regression maybe period. We were out sailing, and in those days I thought I knew more about how to sail than she did. We were coming into the mooring, and I'm thinking she's doing this all along. And my voice level went up and up, and I wasn't.
He screams.
That's another way of putting it. I'm looking for more technical terms. So anyway, then she just lets go of the tillers and what the hell, you landed, which I did beautifully. But anyway, I rowed her in so she could go meet a worker who was going to come and consult with us. And I went back and did what you need to do to get it ready to let a boat stand overnight. Things you got to take care of. And I was feeling pretty bad about the way I had acted because I had done this before and recognized it as a problem. So by the time I got to the house and then I came in and sat down on the peninsula in the kitchen, and I was kind of dreading when I would see Kathy. And then she comes in the room, she walks directly over to me, puts her arms around me and said, I know you're doing the best you can. And that was a beautiful way to avoid a regression. And a regression, that's not going to happen. The defensiveness will rule, and it will drive the thing deeper and deeper, action, reaction. I thought that was just a nice example of her being able just to stay out of that loop. And it worked.
So I would invite the Zoom participants to go ahead and start your questions in the chat room.
No, in the Q&A.
In the Q&A, sorry, in the Q&A. And we'll have a question from our audience.
My name is Bill George.
Control yourself.
This is really fascinating. For a long time, I was a hospital chaplain, and I worked with people in the oncology service, and I was about 4 years the chaplain for the pediatric oncology service. And your talk and your discussion seems to focus on adults and their reaction to stress. How do you, this may be too much to deal with here, but how do you see cancer in children? I mean, we had kids, 8, 9, 10, adolescents, but then sometimes we've had 1 and 2-year-olds, pretty advanced, serious cancer. Be curious about your thoughts about it. I have to admit, it's my experience there that brought me into interested in the whole theory, which is ambiguous, if not ambivalent. So,
Yeah, I think that is a good question. The pediatric cancers. I mean, I saw situations when I was seeing a lot of the families involved in this clinical research where it seemed evident that the family was under tremendous stress, had been for a period of time. And the fact that this 14-year-old developed some kind of brain cancer didn't seem to come as a big surprise, but in other instances, not necessarily the case at all. So I think, again, that's got to be an open question. I think it can be, probably never causes, but can be a factor in how it plays out. But I just don't know the answer to that. It's a good question to raise.
Just a tiny addition. We Candlelighters supported a family support group of people going through the treatment. A social worker and a clinical nurse specialist and I would conduct this. And what we discovered in every family during a period of 2 years, even though the child survived, most of the children did not survive, but the families, after the death, there was a major divorce. I guess that's probably pretty typical, right? I would see it.
If I could just say one other thing. Cancer is such in a very young child, such a very complex question. I wouldn't begin to tackle that. But in terms of the family emotional process, it's worth noting that in my family, I had the same congenital anomaly since I was born, but I didn't almost die with a kidney infection related to that until the whole family was in a paroxysm of anxiety. So I think it's all of the above. It's vulnerability, genetic vulnerability, family vulnerability, environmental vulnerability. I don't think you can hone in on any one variable. I would say that watching in my in-law family, we had a grandniece on the Kerr side who died some years ago of a childhood cancer, and got to watch that one up close and personal over the, I guess, 4 or 5 years that she had it. And I could field a few hypotheses based on that, but they're not, it takes a different shape in every family. And so I don't think there's any one formula to understand it. And certainly with a very young, what about these kids that are born with cancer? How do you understand what's going on, and how do you not rule out the interuterine environment as a conveyor of family emotional stress? It's just very complex, I think.
If I could add to that too, it was a neuroblastoma that my niece had, and my understanding is that the vulnerability may be cells that should have differentiated during the embryo development of the fetus and been fully differentiated by birth, aren't necessarily, and some pretty undifferentiated cells remain. And so that wouldn't necessarily be caused by an emotional process. Wouldn't necessarily be caused by an emotional process, but I could see later on that vulnerability could be stirred up by a family emotional process. This is, respecting the complexity, and that's, I almost hate talking about cancer and emotion because it's so easy to fall off one side or the other. But it's interesting, and I think it begs for an answer. I was going to ask Mike Lumpkin about this too, because even with the infectious diseases, I have an interest in pylori, ulcer, Heliobacterium pylori, where that bacteria can live in harmony. My understanding is for long periods of time in the body, in the stomach, but it's likely necessary ingredient of developing an ulcer. Then at some point, the way I've seen war kind of breaks out between the immune system and the bacteria, and then the bacteria become more virulent in that process, more pathogenic, so to speak. And the inflammatory cells are sort of pounding at them between the two of them. That creates a tumor, meaning an ulcer that can potentially perforate, which is how my father died. I don't know what you think about infectious disease and the role of stress. It seems to me that stress can create a context like Bernard was talking about that may make.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. Infections, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk, but infections trigger things like it's a stress to the body, and so cortisol levels go up during infections, your endogenous cortisol levels. That can also drive acid secretion. And probably one of the ways it's doing it is, and this is just theoretical at the moment, but it's probably those high cortisol levels are probably suppressing some kind of other organism or bacteria that's restraining the Helicobacter pylori. It's restraining it, and when that gets downregulated, then the pylori are free to rampage through the stomach and increase acid secretion and cause ulcers to form. So yeah, there's definitely a connection between stress and infections and the havoc that they can wreak.
Okay, we have some questions from the queue, so Gary, you're on.
Okay, first question from Victoria Harrison. I assume this is for Dr. Kerr. What are some examples of, quote, cognitive self-regulation, end quote? How does working on differentiation of self provide additional resources when the relationship environment is disturbed, chronically anxious? End of question.
I think I understand, and I have my way of talking about that. And I've used many times over the years an example. Over the years, an example where my mother's down for a visit. Unbeknownst to me, I'm more anxious in anticipating her visit. And she's staying in a room in our 2-story townhouse in Northern Virginia. And I'm moving to the bottom of the stairs, and I see Mother coming to the landing to come down. And as she stops at the top and puts her hand on her forehead and kind of slumps. And I find myself, I think because of the exposure to systems thinking, watching myself move toward her to fix this thing in a very protective way. And realizing then or afterwards, I've been doing this all my life, this is part of my chronic anxiety, anticipating when she's going to be distressed and what I'll need to do about it so it doesn't get worse, so it doesn't get worse for me either. And when I saw that, and it was like a breath of fresh air, that this Mother is not causing me to react any more than I played a part in her reacting by being so protective of her in those situations. It was kind of a signal to me, Michael, say something to me. And instead of doing that, I just said, were you coming down? She came down the stairs and she perked up and we went on with the day. And that's why I think it's the objectivity that's possible, limited for sure, about what's going on between people that can make it less threatening. And how do you go about gaining that objectivity is a hard one to answer. I know in the early days, we used to debate around in Bowen's program about, do you have to get less reactive to see what's going on, or do you have to see what's going on to get less reactive, which is probably unanswerable, like why did the chicken cross the road? But it's that objectivity plus action. In this case, it's what I didn't do that seemed to help, that can make it a change. I think it makes it different from a lot of stress control techniques, which are important and valuable, but I think what Bowen theory does is help you conceptualize what's going on in the environment that you're reacting to. I like to say people shoot real bullets. Anyway, I hope that's in line with what you were asking.
Okay, Dr. Yoon, you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment about Mrs. Kerr's presentation is a great example of the theme of this conference, the hidden life of families. Just to be able to lay out in some detail these events that are happening in the family. And without a theory, you really can't connect those dots. Whether it's accurate or not, the future will tell, but it certainly allows one to do that if you have a theory of looking at events and how they connect. And I was thinking of that in relation to Dr. Kerr's comments about family homeostasis, and that family homeostasis would have to do with, if I heard you right, having a sufficient level of connectedness and a sufficient level of emotional distance. And these two things play out with one another. And then, of course, differentiation of self and chronic anxiety influence that balance in terms of how resilient, for a better word, the system is in maintaining homeostasis.
Yeah, initially I think picked up that idea from something in one of Murray's societal papers in which he talked about that man has a deep instinctive desire for emotional closeness and at the same time is allergic to too much of it. And I think we all do face that. And how do you manage that? I think better differentiated people do a little better job. Kathy coming in, putting her arms around me was a nice example, I think, of having learned something. Otherwise, she could have stayed mad and could have been a period of distance that lasted several days, all that we all know about.
I would like to note that there have been other sailing trips in which I have come back and refused for 6 months later to sail with him again. And that has been helpful as much as putting my arms around him.
Well, it's about flexibility. Okay.
I wanted to just follow up on that. The question or the comment from Bob Newman, and I was keying in on part of Mike Kerr's presentation on how increased chronic anxiety tunes up people's responses to the other's distress. And at the same time that one is getting activated to do something about the other's distress, that discomfort impels getting away from the other and the distress. And that whole constellation is so powerful and is so much, I think, a part of the story in my family and in families in general. And that it's hard for people to grab a hold of how much the distance is being impelled by the inability to hold on to self in the intense personal relationships. And that if people can hold on to self, the distance isn't necessary. And the distance itself creates a whole ball of wax reactions in the people who are being distanced from. It's a whole complex system.
Okay, so we're going to take a question from the queue. Gary?
All right, this question is from Pamela Anderson for Dr. Kerr. I think you are making a good case for a systems model in understanding disease in general and cancer in particular. My experience is that medicine, as a medical model, is overly compartmentalized and resists a systemic view. I am wondering if you see this resistance or seeing something else happening in research and ultimately in medical practice.
I don't see any more signs of resistance than you saw in France during World War II. I think Mike Lutman might.
So could you repeat the question? No, I'm serious.
Gary, are you there?
Okay, here comes the question again. I think you are making a good case for a systems model in understanding disease in general and cancer in particular. My experience is that medicine, as in a medical model, is overly compartmentalized and resists a systemic view. I'm wondering if you see this resistance or you are seeing something else happening in research and ultimately in medical practice.
So yes, I couldn't agree more. The medical system is organized in a reductionist fashion for the most part. You know, particularly when we're talking about purely medical approach and diagnosis and treatment. Everything is broken down into individual components, and they're often not related to one another and how they might be related to one another. So that's where, you know, what Michael Kerr has been talking about, what Bowen has talked about, developing a systems model actually makes a lot more sense, because there's obviously A is connected to B, which is connected to C, which is connected to D, and then D is connected back to A again. You have to, I think in modern medicine, what's needed is to start thinking more in those terms. Is that, you know, you don't have an infection as an isolated incident. You don't have a pain in your guts as an isolated incident. You don't have excessive acid secretion in your stomach as an isolated incident. But yet, all those things typically are treated as one thing. They're not treated as part of a system problem. So I would agree that this is a deficiency in the medical model that we have today.
I was going to say, yes. Again, I have an avocational interest in this, but I know enough to be dangerous and read what's coming out in basic research. And it strikes me, and I'm wondering if you, Mike Lumpkin, would comment on this. It seems to me a very strange period of time, because you're a basic researcher, and the basic research is more and more pointing to the system's understanding and model at the time that the practitioner research model seems becoming more embedded in the reductionistic medical model. Do you think that's fair descriptively?
Yes, I think it's fair, and I think another major contributor to this problem is the way health insurance reimburses physicians, which drive this reductionist approach to diagnosis and treatment.
Okay.
I've had a nice experience. Somebody has a cold, and I interact with them one day, and then the next day I'm sniffling. And the person says, "Oh my gosh, did I give you my cold?" I say, "No, I took it."
Yes. Thank you for your presentations this morning. It was of great interest to me. Having been recently diagnosed with breast cancer, which was removed from my right breast, and I was told it was a very early stage. This whole idea that cells keep each other in line and that there's a role is played by the microenvironment. In my situation, even though there was no cancer in the lymph nodes, they feel like they've got everything. It's been suggested to me that I get 12 rounds of chemotherapy, 20 rounds of radiation, plus a Herceptin, plus a pill for 7 years. So I'm trying to take all of that in. So your slide that specifically said putting breast cancer cells under gentle pressure is akin to what they might encounter growing in a healthy breast. It causes them to reconnect with their neighbor and act as non-cancerous cells. I found that extremely interesting. I was wondering if you could talk more about that, Dr. Kerr.
Joan?
Yeah, you
go first.
Okay, well, I can certainly relate to that, unfortunately, because in 2000 I was diagnosed with an early breast cancer and similar kind of thing. They went chemotherapy, and I went for a second chemotherapy. You can see it talked to the first guy, but I didn't take chemotherapy, and my heart is in good shape because it can do damage in the long run. But I was in a family with, it might be why they asked me to be on the panel, I don't know, but over a 7-year period, 2 of my sisters, myself, and my mother were diagnosed with breast cancer. My sister did die. And I think that Bowen theory helped me save myself. And I was thinking about when Dr. Kerr was giving his presentation about the importance of open relationships, which I think when I was diagnosed, and this is probably what helped me when I was diagnosed, I I was a person that kept a lot of things internally. And I forced myself to be more open. Actually, that's when I started presenting at the Bowen Center. I would have never done it. But, so I forced myself to be more open. And I think the focus on myself, on trying to manage myself and differentiate itself and be separate in my family. There had been a lot of disturbance right before all these things happened. And I think that made a big difference. My sister, who got breast cancer, a couple years later than me, she's my younger sister. She did not manage in the same way that I did. She did get, it was more advanced because it wasn't caught in time, and she did get chemotherapy. I have two sisters that did get chemotherapy. One's still doing well, but she saw things differently, and also there was a lot of disturbances in the family, and in the family of origin, in her nuclear family, there was the issues that Dr. Kerr raised about expectations, approval. It was in a regression in her. And so I don't think she was focused on herself. She had a different view of the cancer, which I think, my thinking is that the cancer probably was genetic. Most people in my family get a cancer, most of them don't die from it. But that this anxiety drove the way I think about the metastasis and made a big difference. And I do think focusing on figuring out for yourself, being a separate self, is useful.
Thank you.
Just, I remember one study, I can't quote the exact site, I don't remember it now, I have it in my records or somewhere, but the impression they were getting from serial mammograms over a period of time, I forget the details of this, but the long and short of it was that more cancers seem to spontaneously remit than they ever imagined. They cited a figure of at least 20% can be cited on mammogram, because they went back 6 years, said somebody had a mammogram 6 years ago or something, and figured out that it's not there anymore, whatever it was, and it appeared to spontaneously regress. And certainly there's still not enough known about why some cancers, and how do they regress, and it certainly can inform treatment. As you know, in prostate and melanoma, the incidence of biopsies went up, but the incidence of survival didn't change all that much, suggesting tumors were being treated that didn't necessarily have to be treated. They would be on their own.
Kathleen?
I just wanted to speak. I had a very interesting opportunity in my clinical practice about a year or two after I moved to the island. A woman got referred to me who had a breast cancer and had had a mastectomy, and she was being urged to do chemotherapy and radiation and all the tamoxifen and all of that stuff. And she didn't want to do it. And so instead, the healthcare providers referred her to me, and basically she explained her thinking behind why she wouldn't want to do it. She also didn't want to have breast reconstruction surgery, and we talked at length about the gestalt around the development of the symptoms. She seemed to understand it. She thought she was going to survive. And she just sort of needed someone to say, well, okay. Because the healthcare system was pummeling her. You've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do this. Anyway, long story short, one of the things she wanted to do to help herself was to join an exercise program that exists on the island. Well, it's 5 years later, we're in the same exercise program. She's still walking around with one lopsided breast, and she's healthy as a horse, and she never did any of the things that they told her to do. And her prediction that she would survive was right on the money. But how do you know yourself? and know what's correct for you and understand that.
I think it gets back to what Dr. Lumpkin was talking about. It can be a reductionistic approach that forces people in a direction they may not want to go. And one journalist did an interview with 100 and some odd people who had a cancer diagnosis and were considered, for whatever therapy. And some responded, if you do that therapy with me, you're going to kill me. If I stay in this hospital, you guys are going to kill me. I'm getting out of here. Versus bring it on, doc, all the experimental treatments you got. And both of them could survive. And the conclusion of the journalist was, it was the amount of conviction the person had about what's right for them, that sense of direction that they're comfortable with. And I think that is important, is beyond reductionism.
Okay, we're going to take one more question from the queue. Gary?
Two questions from Houston, Dr. Kerr. How do you get your cells to behave?
How do you get your cells?
That might just not be you, that might be generic you. And the second question is, how do you differentiate your cells?
I think it's time for the break. I think I think the important thing is to recognize that how you interact with people who are important to you can affect your cells and their cells in ways that can be quite, and to think of that. I remember when Kathy had
Are you going to pick on me again?
well, you picked on me a little bit.
I'm sorry.
That's where we're keeping it.
She's the buffer.
She had some GI symptoms. As I remember, her internist wanted her to have all kinds of other tests suspicious of cancer. Kathy was resistant to that. I think saw it more as maybe stress related. Her doctor calls me up and wants me to talk Kathy into doing what he suggests. And was fortunate at that time too. I realized that I thought my emotional distance from her was taking a toll on her too. Took responsibility for the fact that what's going on in her valve may have something to do with how I'm interacting with her, which is something Bowen saw at the NIMH, that anxiety in one person can be expressed as a symptom in another. And just having that idea as something you believe is true, and again, who can prove this completely at this point? That is a base for changing behavior on the part of oneself.
Okay. Question from the audience?
I'm a child psychiatrist and have no experience in Bowen theory, so maybe my questions are going to be a little too primitive. Because
Can you turn the mic down closer to your mouth?
I don't know a lot. I mean, it's a kind of a recent interest that I have, maybe because more of my personal family history, but I was also not trained in psychotherapy very much, or family therapy, which I wish I had, but as a psychiatrist, maybe you don't get that much training in psychotherapy. But I had two questions that I think. One is, you talked about do-overs. Can you do do-overs when the person that you have to work the most is dead or not cooperative? That would be one question. The other question would be, I'm just maybe, again, personal and other members of my family, I wonder what are the thoughts of what kind of cancer or disease the person has according to what they're expressing. So, for example, and the only reason why I'm going to go personal with you is because you said this in the class, in the lecture. because you had kidney problems and then sinuses problems, which are both like a drainage, it's like, so the kidneys are, I guess, vital for the toxicity out of your system. And the sinuses are also kind of a major kind of block that you're not getting rid of. And so, and then your father had this lung cancer, and it seems like you couldn't breathe inside your family. So I don't know, I was just thinking about it. And also, I know Dr. Kerr talked about like the sailing situation that gave me an example of your, I guess I'm learning the lower reactivity that might encourage others' behaviors that might be maybe more healthy, but also I wonder how you're able to drain. It seems like you're trying to glue the situation and kind of low reactive, but then are you still able to drain it, or you're still having sinus infections? I'm not sure. And I ask that because of my, I like to learn about it.
Okay, so let me try both of those and then see if other people have comments. In terms of do-overs with dead people, I have two thoughts about that. Oftentimes, people can find a person who is a decent substitute for that dead person to work on the do-over with that person. So you can find someone, say, who is emotionally significant, like a mother or a father, or who was very close to a mother or a father, and you can work on it in those relationships. And this is going to sound really woo-woo, but you can also do it with dead people. I remember having a coaching session with Dr. Bowen one time, and I reported that when I I made a number of visits to that boarding school where my father had a very important emotional experience for him. And I went one time to the chapel, and then when I was having a coaching session later, I said, when I was in that chapel, a lot of emotion welled up in me about my father and things I would like to say to my father, and I felt like he was there. He said, why don't you go back? Why don't you go back until that emotion isn't there? And why don't you go back and have a conversation with your father? Damned if I didn't. And that was a do-over conversation, and it had to do with, you bastard, you left me with your wife. That wasn't my job. That was your job. That was no gift. I'm not grateful for that. And, no, I'm not going to take care of your wife for the rest of my life. It was a very lively conversation. And it was very helpful. Now, you can call that woo-woo, but it was helpful. I think it contributed to the process of a little more separation. So I think there are multiple ways to get a hold of the emotional process and have a do-over. In the second, I'm afraid that I theoretically think of those type of descriptions about physical symptoms as a bit individually oriented, psychoanalytically based interpretations. And I don't find them particularly helpful in thinking about vulnerability to different types of symptoms. I know lots of people do. I don't find them helpful. I think more about multi-generational tuning genetically and behaviorally towards different body systems and symptoms in those systems. Those are two words that are so that I don't find that particularly helpful for my own thinking. I know lots of people think that way, but it doesn't inform my own theoretical thinking about symptoms.
Dr. Kerr?
If I could just add one more, I think, example, I hope it'll be useful. I had my 60th high school reunion about 6 weeks ago. And I was back in my hometown of Swarthmore, which is near where my parents and schizophrenic brother are buried. nearby cemetery about 20 minutes away. And my schizophrenic brother committed suicide. And all the emotions that go with being around that. Anyway, then in my book, I've dedicated, among other dedications, to my schizophrenic brother. And also in the epilogue, I wrote up how I thought the changing context of the family over time, just like Kathy was doing, affected the ups and downs of what was diagnosed in him as schizophrenia, which I thought was reductionistic to just focus on that being within him. So when I was up there, I went to the cemetery. I thought I owed the family this, my parents and my brother, after dedicating the book to them and writing about it. And so I went to the cemetery and I went to my parents' graves and said, Mother, I know you love my brother as much as any mother could love a son, and try the best you could to improve his life. I don't know who's listened to this. I'm just talking in the cemetery. And then I said the same to my father. I said, you tried to do what you thought was best and to help Mother and helping Billy. So then I got to Billy's grave, which had to take me a while to find it. But I said to Billy, thank you very much for saving my life. And people who know Bowen theory understand that. But for me, it was helpful to just do that, even though it was just about me, not him at that point. But really feeling a kind of gratitude about him being stuck in that triangle, and that I benefited from that. And it's hard to look at that in the eye and not feel maybe a little guilty about it. My mother used to say, oh, Billy's having problems because you boys have been so successful and he hasn't. That's a guilt trip of sorts. And so I think, yeah, the feelings about the past, I think Family Systems offers something extra about resolving things, that, even though the people may not still be alive.
Okay, so our time actually, the morning is up and we're going to be breaking for lunch. So all of you in the room and in Kansas and all of you out wherever you are, come back at 1:20. We have an hour for lunch. We'll see you then.